It was my freshman year of college. I was living in the freshman dorms, and there were 4 floors to this building. The first floor had community spaces, televisions, laundry, ice machines, and a kitchenette. And the 3 other floors were all residential, gender separate with communal bathrooms. Each tiny room had 2 beds and a long desk to share, along with 2 closets and 2 vanities with mirrors. The buildings on campus were historic, particularly the freshman dorms, and that dorm was the oldest building on campus that used to house nuns. Before the college was co-ed, before it was an all-girls college, a particular order of nuns came to the area to teach the budding community. The city is now a very diverse and very large, well-known bustling gateway to the south, but this school is known for its art programs, as well as its programs for special education, sports therapy and speech therapy, so there were twice as many girls as there were young men, and a good portion of them had sports scholarships. I myself joined the bowling team whilst getting my Bachelor of Fine Arts, and I was roomed on the 4th floor with a nice young woman pursuing a career in physical sports therapy. She was an absolutely amazing basketball player, but I had never had any interest in sporting events in my life, and found myself cheering her on during games and even watching games with her on our shared TV. For 2 opposite people, we both enjoyed sharing the art world and the sports world, and I'd invite her to art student parties, and she would take me along when any team hosted a party. Directly across the hall was a showroom for the dorm, which was empty every year, and no one was assigned that room ever. The faculty generally wouldn't talk about why the room had to remain empty, even though the campus was very, very small, and any space was usually utilized. Now, rooming with an athlete, I got to smell daily the uniforms, shoes, and a basketball she kept, and sometimes she would dribble it in the room. Other girls had this same habit. I became aware of the dead girl across the hall on the same night of a large party celebrating a streak of victories. That night I was working on a large project, so I gave my roommate some congratulations and a hug, but excused myself from the party. She understood and promised to bring me a few pizza slices. Then I worked pretty late into the night, playing music at a low volume and waiting on the return of my roomie, so I knew she would be safe for the night, i.e. no drinking and driving. The dorm was eerily quiet, so quiet that the sound of a bouncing basketball surprised me, and I was curious to see who was back, so I left our room to explore and find out. As I opened my door, the smell of basketballs and a newly waxed court was overpowering. I could still hear the ball and wanted to say hi, so I went looking through the floor. There was no one in any room, even the RA was gone, so I moved down to the 3rd floor, and the smell was fading. The ball, however, I could hear sounded like it was above me. I knocked on doors, but again everyone had gone to the party. On the 2nd floor, the smell and sound were gone, and the only living person I could find was that floor's RA. I explained to her the odd noise and smell, and she was curious, so together we searched the building to find no other living soul. But when we reached my room, the RA admitted hearing the basketball in the room across the hall, but no one was supposed to enter that room, and it was always locked, so we were both a bit creeped out. The RA called a security guard to come check it out, as she didn't have a key, and he heard the ball too. He told us no one would be in there, but he unlocked the door, and as he turned the knob, the sound stopped and the smell vanished. When we looked in, not a soul, nor a basketball could be found. Later I talked to the most senior guard, and he informed me that there were paranormal investigations done due to any student assigned to the room refusing to sleep there. Apparently, when the college was an all-girls school, a young lady who was known for her love of basketball had tragically taken her own life in that room. The college had hushed the event up as much as possible, but I eventually found an article through some rigorous research at the city library. So for the rest of that year, whenever I was alone late at night, I'd smell the poor girl and hear her basketball. I got to the point where I would say good morning or good night when no one was close by, and I did a small drawing of her, wrote a note about how sorry I was that she felt so much pain, then slipped both under the door to her. I never found out why she'd done what she did, and I don't know if my note or drawing was ever found. I just know the ball stopped when I said goodnight. I hope maybe having someone know her story helped her to move on, but I'll never know for sure.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all this support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
On 620 South Main Street of Los Angeles, California, sits a rather unassuming-looking hotel. Opened on December 20th of 1924, the 19-story 700-room hotel had recently undergone something of a makeover. It's now known as the Stay on Main and has been undergoing renovations for the last few years and is due to open again in October of 2021. But whether or not the hotel will see many bookings is anyone's guess, as the place has, shall we say, a rather dark past. You see, for almost 100 years, the Stay on Main was known as the Cecil Hotel, and it's most famous for being the site of an inordinate number of murders, people taking their own lives, and otherwise unexplainable deaths. In the early 1920s, American hoteliers William Hanner, Charles Dix, and Robert Shops pooled together their capital and opened the Cecil as ideal accommodation for travelers and tourists alike. Designed and constructed in the Beaux Art style, the hotel boasted an opulent marble lobby with stained glass windows, potted palms, and alabaster statuary. Each of the hoteliers brought a vast amount of business acumen to the table, and it seemed the Cecil was destined to be a roaring success. But within 5 years of its grand opening, America would plunge into financial ruin, as Wall Street would bring one of the darkest days in U.S. stock market history. It's little surprise that this tumultuous event is the thing that seems to have preceded such a morbid decline, but even for such a depressing period of history, the Cecil seems to have been the center of some kind of grim maelstrom, as the deaths came thick and fast from then on. In November of 1931, 46-year-old W.K. Norton took his own life by ingesting poison. A week prior, he had checked into the Cecil under the guise of a man named James Willies from Chicago. It's not certain why Norton took his own life, but it's been commonly speculated that it was related to the financial crisis of the previous 2 years. Less than a year later, in September of 1932, 25-year-old Benjamin Doddich shot himself in the head while sitting on a Cecil hotel bed. A maid found his body the following morning, but again, it's not clear why the young man decided to take his own life, as he neglected to leave a note. In late July of 1934, former Army Medical Corps Sergeant Louis D. Borden checked into a room at the Cecil, only to slash his own throat with a straight razor in the hotel bathroom. Yet unlike the previous two, the 53-year-old left several notes, one of which cited poor health as the reason for his actions. A tragic yet perfectly understandable reason to take your own life, but just as terrifying and bizarre was that he too should gravitate to the Cecil in the final hours of his life. In the decade that followed, many more of these unexplained deaths would occur, around a third of them involving military men. But the nature of the deaths at the Cecil would not evolve until September of 1944, when a young woman named Dorothy Jean Purcell seemed to be overcome with a temporary but terrible madness. Dorothy had booked a stay at the Cecil with her 38-year-old boyfriend, Ben Levine. All was well until the middle of the night when Dorothy awoke in terrible pain. She soon realized that what she was experiencing was contractions and that she was going into labor. Terrified and confused, she dragged herself into the hotel bathroom, quietly giving birth to a tiny baby boy. Dorothy later claimed that she had no idea she was even pregnant, and as such, she'd done absolutely no research into what to expect. According to her, the baby was silent as the grave, leading her to believe that it was some kind of stillbirth. Yet, instead of waking her boyfriend or calling for help, Dorothy Purcell opened up the bathroom window as quietly as she could, then tossed her infant son out into the night. The deceased child was later found on the roof of an adjacent building, yet It was determined that the child had still been alive at the time it had been thrown from the hotel window. Naturally, there was a palpable level of public outrage once the story graced local newspapers, and Dorothy Purcell was tracked down and arrested on suspicion of murder. However, after being psychoanalyzed by not one, but 3 psychiatrists, Dorothy was determined to be mentally confused at the time of the birth, and was acquitted in January of 1945 by reason of insanity. By all accounts, she'd had no history of mental health problems prior to checking into the Cecil, and had absolutely no explanation for the event itself. It seems like a horrible coincidence that such a thing would occur while staying at the Cecil Hotel, but the question remains, were there other forces at work which induced both Dorothy's labor and the so-called confused state that followed? Between 1944 and 1962, a handful of other people took their own lives at the Cecil Hotel, all of them involving death by falling. One of these was particularly gruesome, given that it didn't just take one life, but 2. On October 12th of 1962, 27-year-old Pauline Otten jumped from the window of her 9th floor room after an argument with her estranged husband, Dewey, who had stormed out of the suite just moments before. In a sickening twist of fate, Pauline landed on a passing pedestrian, 65-year-old George Giannini, with the impact killing them both instantly. As there were no witnesses, police initially believed that Pauline and George had taken their life together, possibly as some kind of bizarre death pact. However, it was soon determined that not only was Giannini wearing shoes at the time of his death, he also had his hands in his pockets. Had he jumped, his shoes would have likely fallen off during the fall or upon impact, and his hands would have definitely not have remained in his pockets. It's quite incredible that such an unfortunate event could even occur. There was literally not another soul on the street that day, and Pauline just so happened to land perfectly atop her unlikely victim. Again, is this purely coincidence, or was there something else at work that day? The next bizarre death to occur at the Cecil was that of 65-year-old retired telephone operator Goldie Osgood. Osgood was well known around the area and had earned the nickname of Pigeon Goldie because she fed birds in nearby Pershing Square. She was a regular sight around the square, perennially sporting the LA Dodgers baseball that she seemed to cherish so dearly. But on June 4th of 1964, a member of the Cecil's housekeeping staff entered Goldie's room to find the place had been ransacked. Birdseed was scattered all over the room, something Goldie carried around everywhere with her, and her beloved LA Dodgers cap was lying in a pool of blood just feet away from her lifeless corpse. She had been beaten, carnally violated, and then stabbed almost 30 times with a large serrated knife. Just hours after her murder, 29-year-old Jacques Ellinger was spotted walking through Pershing Square with his clothes absolutely soaked in blood. This is at a time when DNA analysis hadn't been invented yet, but since there was a literal trail of blood from Goldie's hotel room to Pershing Square, it was pretty easy to deduce that Jacques had been Goldie's killer. But this is where things get weird. Despite the killing being connected to a handful of other murders in the area, Jacques claimed that he had no memory of any murder and had in fact blacked out for a few hours, led to police dropping all charges against him. What should have been an open and shut case was muddied and crippled by some mysterious internal or external influence, and once again, the Cecil Hotel was inextricably involved somehow. 2 more mysterious deaths by falling occurred at the Cecil in the years 1975 and 1992, but perhaps the most famous of all the Cecil's enigmatic deaths is that of 21-year-old Canadian college student Elisa Lam. Enrolled at the University of British Columbia, Elisa decided to do a post-Christmas trip down to California in early 2013. She traveled solo via Amtrak and inner-city buses, taking time out to visit the San Diego Zoo and eventually arriving safely in LA on January 26th. 2 days later, she checked into the Cecil Hotel, opting for one of the hotel's cheaper shared rooms on its 5th floor. However, just a day or 2 into her stay, her impromptu roommates began to complain that Elisa was exhibiting some rather off behavior. As a result, hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room at no extra cost. It's worth noting at this stage that Elisa had been previously diagnosed with both depression and bipolar disorder and was taking 4 separate medications to combat the symptoms. However, not a single member of her family said that she had any history whatsoever of any thoughts of taking her own life. According to them, Elisa had her own struggles, but she determined to conquer adversity and lead a happy, productive life. Yet they did admit to one incident in which Elisa had gone missing for a brief period of time. Naturally, her parents were mildly concerned about her well-being during a solo trip down to Cali and asked Elisa to check in with them every day she was there. Elisa was only too happy to comply and called daily to share travel stories and swap I love yous. However, on February 1st of 2013, the very same day she was due to check out of the Cecil, her daily phone call didn't come. Elisa's parents grew increasingly worried until eventually they contacted the LAPD to report Elisa missing. Police jumped into action, driving down to the Cecil to question hotel staff. A number of the housekeeping team had seen Elisa on the day she disappeared, reporting that she was alone and that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Police also spoke to the manager of a nearby bookstore that Elisa frequented during her stay, who told them Elisa was outgoing, lively, and very friendly, talking about what books she was getting and whether or not what she was getting would be too heavy for her to carry around as she traveled. In short, it's clear that Elisa was suffering from poor mental health, at least during the morning anyway. As a follow-up, police searched the Cecil and the surrounding area as best they could, using sniffer dogs and helicopter support. But given that no foul play was suspected, the LAPD was unable to search the entire hotel, leaving one detective with the terrible feeling that they were just inches away from finding a girl that was in grave and mortal danger. On February 6th of 2013, a week after she was last spotted, the LAPD circulated flyers with Elisa's image and brought the case to the public's attention through local media outlets. Just over a week later, having still made no progress in the case, LAPD released footage of Lamb's last known sighting, taken from an elevator surveillance camera on February 1st. The roughly 3-minute video shows a solitary Elisa making unusual movements and gestures while appearing to hide in the elevator. It also appears as if Elisa was trying to get the elevator car to move in order to escape from someone who was pursuing her. Some speculated that the bout of paranoia may have been the result of her ingesting some kind of party drug, such as MDMA, while others suggest her behavior was that of a textbook psychotic episode. Yet perhaps the most disturbing suggestion was from a self-proclaimed video editing expert who asserted that the CCTV footage had been tampered with before being released to the general public. Besides the obvious obscuring of the timestamp, this expert claimed that not only had parts of the footage been deliberately slowed down, but almost an entire 60 seconds of the footage had been erased. If this is true, it's fairly obvious why this might be done, and that's to protect the identity of someone who happened to appear in the video. Yet at the same time, could it be to protect the person responsible for Elisa's disappearance? 19 days after Elisa initially went missing, guests at the Cecil Hotel began to complain of low water pressure in their faucets and showers. This was on top of existing complaints that there was a weird taste and color to the tap water. So on the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker took the stairs up to the hotel's roof, intending to inspect the 4,000-gallon tanks that supplied the hotel's water. 3 of the 4 tanks were completely clear of any debris or blockages, but upon opening the 4th, the maintenance worker let out a blood-curdling scream as he was faced with the bloated, decomposing body of none other than Elisa Lam. 2 days later, the LA coroner's office released a statement saying that the cause of Elisa's death was accidental drowning, adding that her bipolar disorder played a significant factor in her untimely demise. Although the clothes she'd been wearing in the elevator CCTV footage were found in the tank with her, she had apparently been stripped naked at some point, with a sand-like substance covering the parts of her body that weren't submerged in the water. This sand-like substance was never identified, and there remains intense speculation as to what it might have been. Analysis of Elisa's body showed that there was no evidence of physical trauma, carnal assault, or her taking her own life. Toxicology tests showed traces of the prescription medication she was using, along with a very small amount of alcohol, but no traces of other recreational drugs could be found in her bloodstream. The amount of prescription medication was found to be slightly less than the effective dose, yet experts believe this wasn't low enough to spark off any kind of psychotic episode and dismiss this as being to blame for Elisa's death. All of these details certainly make for an intensely morbid mystery. Perhaps one of the most confounding aspects of the case is just how Elisa got into the water tank in the first place. You see, most of the doors and staircases that led to the hotel's roof were supposedly locked at the time the young Canadian disappeared, and only members of staff have the passcodes and keys to these passages. Any attempt to force them would have triggered an alarm at the hotel front desk, maybe even a hotel-wide fire alarm if any of the entrances were fire doors. Surely it's entirely possible that the hotel's fire escape would allow her to reach the roof unimpeded, but sniffer dogs only followed her scent about halfway up the staircase, then indicated that she must have used an open window to scramble onto the roof instead of the door, which was just feet away. On top of that, all 4 tanks were 4x8-foot cylinders propped up on concrete blocks, meaning there was no fixed access to them and hotel workers had to use a ladder to get a look at the water. Each was protected by heavy steel lids that would be extremely difficult to properly replace from within. Essentially, all of this pointed to the idea that someone, or something, had somehow killed Elisa and disposed of her body in the water tank, all without being detected by any of the hotel's security cameras. Of all the mysterious deaths that occurred at the Cecil Hotel, Elisa's gives us the most detailed and intimate look into what kind of fate might have befallen them. It's clear that over the years many of the hotel guests had suffered psychotic episodes or blackouts during their stays, and at a rate far higher than any other hotel in the country. And in spite of the fact that these deaths have been occurring for almost 100 years, we're still no closer to offering up concrete explanations for their untimely demises. Perhaps all of the murders, people taking their own life, and enigmatic deaths have perfectly reasonable and logical explanations to them, explanations that modern science would quite easily have explained. But perhaps there's something more sinister at work here, that the truth behind the Cecil is more akin to Stephen King's The Shining than we'd ever be comfortable admitting to ourselves.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
I work the evening shift at a hospital that is believed to be, at least by 90% of the staff, haunted. I'm part of the 90%. You see, there have been horror stories about every building, floor, and pretty much every part of the campus. I mostly wander around alone as a housekeeper, and that makes it much worse. At least when my mind is on it. Usually I try not to think about it. My personal experience was back in the ultrasound wing of the radiology clinic. By the time I get around to that area, the lights automatically dim, and there isn't anything I can do about it. It's always spooky back there at night, so I usually just get done with what I need to do and move on. The place is kind of shaped like a J, like a long hallway that curves around. On the inner side of the curve, there's a dressing room that opens up to a mammography suite, and then opens again at the top of the J. If you're standing at the bottom of the J, you can see through the doors of both rooms to the top of the J. I was standing back there, trying to bag on my cart, when something moved in the corner of my eye. I looked up, and through the dressing and mamma rooms, to the other doorway opposite me. I vividly remember it like it was yesterday. A male figure walks past the door right before my eyes. I literally watched it amble slowly across my field of vision. There are no male ultrasound techs here, and it was not my boss. It looked like it was wearing dark clothing, had long hair, but was definitely male. I snapped out of it and ran over to see if some freak had wandered in, but there wasn't anyone. I grabbed my stuff and ran out without finishing all the work, 'cause screw that. Another story, which isn't my personal experience, comes from the second floor of the hospital. The second floor has nothing but offices and computer labs, all adjacent to one corridor that spans the entire length of the building. On one end is a set of elevators, and on the other, a pair of double doors that opens into a computer lab. This floor is infamous for being the domain of something the workers affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard about her was from a co-worker who knew someone who worked on that floor. He came in for whatever reason doing office stuff and was going home late one night. He walks out of the office and starts towards the elevators when something catches his eye, so he turned towards the computer lab. At the end of the hallway, there was what looked like a patient peeking into the lab. He walks towards her and asks her who she is and what floor she came from. She turns around, and she has no face. The office guy is frozen in place, scared out of his mind. He wants to run away, but he doesn't want to turn his attention away from whoever or whatever is staring him down at the other end of the hall. What does he do instead? He closes his eyes as tight as he can, and after several seconds or minutes or however long it was, he opens them, and she's gone. He says he's never ran as fast in his life as he did that night, straight outside without ever looking back. Another Matilda happening was when one of the managers left a tape recorder going in his office, also on the second floor, because he wanted to see if he could catch any weird noises or voices. The next day I'm walking by his office with a co-worker, and he calls us in there and plays the recording to see if we hear it. After forever with nothing, a faint voice comes in and says, "Turn it off." That was spooky as hell. I've got another story. I'm in the MRI suite right now where my friend, Sandra, told me she had a scary experience. Like the ultrasound area, MRI can sometimes give off a creepy vibe. I've never seen anything back here personally, but Sandra has. She told me about a time where she had come in late one night to prep the MRI. The suite is shaped like a W, with the middle wedge representing the computer workstation and the outer ones being the MRI rooms themselves. On opposite sides of the workstation, there are windows looking into the rooms, and you can see the reflection of the window behind you in the one in front of you. She was back here alone that night, prepping the machine and half asleep. It began to dawn on her that something felt wrong, and she began to experience a feeling of dread. Whatever it was made her feel so uncomfortable and restless that she snapped out of it and woke up. She looks up into the window, into the suite, and sees a silhouette of a figure standing in the corner. She doesn't know what the hell it is. Thinking, she sees things, but remembers how I said you can see the reflection of one window in that other? She realizes that the figure isn't standing in the corner of that room, but is rather standing in front of the other window behind her, just staring at her.